Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please hit that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. Let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Nina Farnia. Professor Farnia is a legal historian focusing on the role of modern imperialism in US law and US politics. Her publications explore a variety of related subjects, including US foreign affairs, economic coercive measures, and most importantly, for the current moment, Iran. Professor Farnia, welcome to India and Global Left.
Thank you very much for having me.
I wanted to focus on Iran, of course, and we have been doing interviews and many more to follow on the recent developments. But given your work, your writings on US foreign policy and on Iran, I thought I would start with some broader questions about US imperialism in the region. And so, my first question is, how do you place this chapter of West Asia in the last 2 years or so um, since Alaska flood operation? We have seen a genocide in Palestine, fall of Assad government in Syria, Syria being incorporated into the imperial sphere, war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now a series of war rather with Iran. How do you define this chapter in a larger textbook of US imperialism?
So I think what I often say in my own work is that Al-Aqsa flood changed the world. And what we're seeing now are the reverberations of the effects of that. Uh, the reality is that US imperialism is in severe decline. It's there just right now all over the media there's concern, all over the mainstream media in the United States there's concern about the air defense systems, that they're not going to last more than 4 or 5 more days, or maybe at max a week. The air defense systems in the region, the US weaponry is slow to manufacture, very, very expensive, much more expensive than the cheap drones that the Iranians and the Russians and the Chinese have. And there are a whole host of economic and political crises facing the United States and its own population. So those are the objective conditions that we're in now. What has become clear is that in this moment of crisis for empire, empire is becoming more chaotic and more aggressive. And what one could liken it to a cornered and injured animal, right? A cornered and injured animal is going to lash out in order to protect whatever remains of its health. That is precisely what the US is doing right now. One of my colleagues, Toussaint Lossier, published an article on the 12-day war about the US strategy right now. And he identifies it as short sequential wars throughout the world. The 12-day war was one of those short sequential wars. This war was probably supposed to be another short war, but the Iranians have had enough. They've truly had enough. After the 12-day war, after the presence of Mossad agents and CIA agents on the streets, dismembering the bodies of Iranians, setting them on fire, causing massive urban warfare, and following, right, 40 over nearly a half century of sabotage and other types of wars. The Iranians have had enough. And so we're in a phase of struggle where, on the one hand, you have the decline of the most powerful empire in world history. And on the other hand, you have the peoples of the world, specifically in Asia, fighting back. And so this is a pivotal moment in terms of world history. This is truly a pivotal moment. If the war continues, this could be a defining moment for the future of US imperialism.
And if you could comment on the relationship of Israel and the United States. in the larger framework of US imperialism, given many scholars like John Mearsheimer, even diplomats, ex-diplomats like Alistair Crook and others, whom many of whom I have interviewed, they're not necessarily from the left, but some of their analysis are helpful. They say as if it is all about Israel lobby. That some of them even claim that Donald Trump doesn't want to do this war. It's all Israel lobby that has sucked him into this war. So I wonder, I'm curious about your thoughts on the role or relationship between the Zionist regime in occupied Israel and the United States.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with that line of thinking, and I understand it, but it's incorrect. The Israel is a proxy of the, up until recently, I called it a proxy of the United States. In fact, it's more akin to a giant military base or a garrison. It is the most important proxy or military base of the United States in the world. It cannot exist without US support. And that is the critical factor here. A political economic analysis, if you look at the financial flows, a political economic analysis shows that Israel could not exist without US support, whether it's support for its industry or support for its weaponry. So the fact that Israel and the US may sometimes disagree, and that is true, that is very true. Over the course of many administrations, Israeli politicians and American politicians have often disagreed. That doesn't suggest that has dragged the United States in. The Epstein crisis does not suggest that Israel has dragged the United States in, because the point of fact, the reality is that Epstein lived here. He was operating here in the milieu of the Western elite. And the work that he was effectuating supported US imperialism. It advanced the objectives of US imperialism. And those objectives happen to align with Israeli objectives as well, because Israel is a proxy of the United States. So, and the Iranians are clear about this, right? That this is what is important about the Iranian strategy. The Iranians know that striking at Israel is striking at US imperialism in the region. And the fact that Israel doesn't have enough, I mean, according to the mainstream media right now, Israel does not have enough interceptors to last more than a week. So this puts not just Israel in crisis, but the US in crisis as well.
And what is your assessment of the GCC countries, given there have been strikes now as we are doing this? Kuwait has confirmed that several US warplanes have been downed by Iranian missiles, and we are really on the brink of what is very uncertain if in the region. So, what is your sense of all these bases in Kuwait, in Bahrain, in UAE, in Qatar? We have seen massive protests in Bahrain, and given the demographics and how they have been suppressed, these nations are really at the brink. Seems to be at the brink at this moment. In the larger context of U.S. Imperialism, and as Iran officials have said that Iran will treat hosting nations, hosting US bases as their own enemies in their self-defense. Is your assessment about their role in the US empire?
So there are a couple of important factors here. Number one, perhaps the most important, Iran has been very clear that it is not in a struggle against the peoples of it is not in a fight against the peoples of the Arab region, including the peoples that live in the Gulf countries. That its fight is with the US bases in those countries that are hosted by those regimes that largely are disliked or hated by their own people. And the best indication are these videos that have come out from Bahrain and other countries throughout the Gulf, where people are actually cheering the fall of Iranian missiles on the American bases, right? I mean, these videos are remarkable. So that's number one. Number two is that Iran, after at the end of the aggression against Yemen, Iran and Saudi Arabia, with the help of China, arrived to a détente. And that détente has been incredibly troubling for the United States because the United States has historically viewed Saudi Arabia as one of its most important uh, proxies. Um, and so it it looks like, I mean, just this is just news that's happening right now. Uh, Aramco, it looks like, got struck in Saudi Arabia. The Iranians are coming out and saying we will not be striking uh, oil rigs, etc., oil and gas installations in the region. And so it's not clear who struck Aramco, but if the Iranians are being honest, and I think they are, it looks like there's an effort to drag Saudi Arabia into the war. And the US has already said they want to drag the Gulf countries directly into the war. And they want to drag the E3, Germany, France, and the UK into the war. I'm sure that the E3 are already providing some level of coordination and support for the US and Israel. Um, so I think in terms of the war itself, we're at an inflection point where if Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries are convinced to enter, that changes some of the calculations. Though frankly, I'm not sure how much, um, because the US has also shown that it's not capable or willing to defend all of those Gulf countries plus Israel in light of the problem with its air defense systems and its problems with its air defense systems and weaponry.
Absolutely. I guess it's a good point to ask you a little bit about the resistance against the empire. And maybe a good point to begin is by discussing a little bit about the legacy of martyred Ayatollah Said Ali Khamenei, given his fierce voice and work against imperialism in the region, his role in the 1980s during the not sure to define proxy war or direct war, but the Iran-Iraq war. He was one of the leading figures in building the security apparatus, administrative apparatus, and after 89, taking the role of the spiritual and religious role. He built the country. He was one of the leading architect of the administrative mechanisms. So if you could tell us a little bit about his legacy and what could change after him.
Yeah, so he was a remarkable figure. And if you um, right now on social media, images are being posted and circulated about his relationships and his work. And he, as part of his legacy, he is viewed as one of the sort of great 20th century revolutionaries. He sat with Fidel Castro, he sat with Hugo Chavez, with Maduro, with Thomas Sankara, with Mandela, with Mugabe. And so that's sort of the crowd, I guess, to use colloquial language, that he ran with, right? His last state visit prior to becoming supreme leader was to China. And there are great photos of that visit. He was he was active and he fought in the Iran-Iraq War. He was jailed at one point. He was a political dissident and he was imprisoned and tortured prior to the revolution. He came to power in 1989 following the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. And he's viewed within the Iranian political sphere, he's viewed as somewhat of a moderating political figure. And what this means is that he was able to bring together a variety of different political factions, right? Iran is a very diverse, has a very diverse political environment, contrary to popular belief, right? It has a very, very diverse political environment. And he was able to bring together those various political factions that have varying interests and expectations, and actually not just maintain stability, but create strength from that. And so that was part of the state building project that the state engaged in, both following the Iran-Iraq war, the US proxy war, and the establishment of the Islamic Republic. Because it's important to remember that the Islamic Republic came into power in 1979. The Iraq invaded Iran with the sort of at the suggestion of the United States and with US support in 1980. That war lasted until 1988. Khomeini died in 89, and that's when Khamenei came into power. And so he was really responsible for building the state and creating the nation state that we're now seeing in terms of the Islamic Republic. Throughout the 90s, there were many reforms and even up till now, there were many, many reforms that are still up for debate among the Iranian public. But these are healthy debates indicative of a strong society and political milieu that is engaged and that is looking toward its future and trying to determine what its future looks like. What is really important about Ayatollah Khamenei, and this goes back to the beginning of my comments, is that he was a committed anti-imperialist. He was truly, truly committed to anti-imperialism. And there's an interview circulating on social media that he did with 60 Minutes, I think when he was president, where they ask him, who is the primary enemy of Iran? And he says the United States. So he had a very rigorous analysis of US imperialism and of its role in attempting to defeat the Iranian revolution and the Iranian struggle. And I'll end by saying that he was a very close mentor of Sayed Hassan Nasrallah. And the interviews, Nasrallah did a series of interviews that are posted on Khamenei's website. And they're very, very interesting. He talks about particular moments when he or Hezbollah were struggling, and they went to Khamenei, and Khamenei provided calm, he provided direction, he provided patience, but he also provided a strategic acumen that they were not able to receive anywhere else. So he was a very important figure for the region, for the resistance, and for Iran. That being said, there's a philosophy among believers, and I would say even among non-believers, that martyrs never die, and that in some instances, martyrs are even more powerful after death than they are in life. And Khamenei's assassination by the United States may have been a political miscalculation because much of the world is up in arms about his death, not just because it was illegal and vicious and savage, and that he was assassinated in his office along with his family and his grandchildren, right? But also because there are many people throughout the world that saw him as their leader, as their spiritual leader. And they have come out, and a lot of them are calling for revenge. They're very angry. So we'll see what, if anything, comes of this. But it does look like, from the US standpoint, it may have been a strategic miscalculation that they always make, and this is due to their racism, frankly, and white supremacy, is that they think that by committing what they call decapitation strikes, right, which is what they have done to President Maduro of Venezuela, what they did to Sayed Hassan Nasrallah, etc., that they will kill the resistance or they will kill the nation state. And this is due to the fact that they think our peoples are incapable of having political or strategic or historical depth. The fact of the matter is that Khamenei, he said it himself, that he is one man with one body, and that it is the Iranian nation that is going to hold this struggle and defeat US imperialism. And that's what we're seeing now. Khamenei passed a few days ago. He was killed a few days ago, I should say. But the struggle continues and it appears to be escalating.
Can you also briefly talk about some of his economic redistributive programs, if you like, particularly under circumstance of severe sanctions that have led to slower growth, higher inflation, currency crisis, etc. But the Iranian state has been trying their best to redistribute resources towards its people. If you could tell our viewers a little bit about that.
Yeah, I really appreciate your question and the particular framing of that question, especially in light of the sanctions. Iran faces one of the most severe sanctions regimes in the world, which involves actual, freezing of its assets, of its cash in bank accounts throughout the world, seizing of its ships and its tankers in the high seas, in addition to shutting it out of markets almost completely, up until recently, almost completely, denying it access to vital medical supplies and infrastructure, capital infrastructure, etc. So these sanctions are incredibly severe. In the late 2010s, Khamenei announced an initiative that he called the resistance economy, where he said that they're going to try to basically build a domestic sovereign economic infrastructure that is no longer dependent on the outside. And it has been actually in less than 10 years, I think, it's been quite successful. Setar Sadeghi and Christopher Weaver wrote an article about this in Middle East Critique, where they describe how Iran has a thriving biotech industry. It is now an exporter of household appliances. It has thriving industries across multiple sectors, and it is increasingly self-reliant. And so this self-reliance has actually spread throughout society, where the resources that are the wealth that is produced both from oil and gas sales and from this resistance economy is basically redistributed through an excellent healthcare system, an excellent education system, through an agricultural sector that is something like, I can't remember the figure, but it's, I think, 60 or 70, but maybe 80% self-sufficient now. I can't remember the figure. Iran is one of the biggest suppliers in the world of multiple foodstuffs that people consume on a regular basis. The literacy rate is in the high 90th percentiles. And so the figures are quite staggering for a state that has been under siege, under direct siege for almost half a century. It's remarkable what Iran has been able to do, what the Islamic Republic has been able to do in terms of human development. And I'll end by saying that the Human Development Indicator, according to the UN Development Program, is at around 80, which is comparable to Cuba's, another country, a communist country, that is under severe siege by the Americans. So what we see is that the redistributive impulse and redistributive policies can actually work despite sanctions.
I wanted to ask you one specific question about the impact of the war on the domestic political economy of Iran, because some experts or analysts have said that this war is also an attempt to um, turn Iran into a garrison state like North Korea. Uh, in other words, to divert critical resources flowing into important sectors of the economy like healthcare, industry, education, etc., entirely towards war. How concerned are you about the impact of the war on Iran and its critical sectors?
I, it's that's an understandable concern. Um, I it doesn't look like the US is going to be able to sustain this war for very long. That's the reality. Of course, things can change, right? In the battlefield, things change quite rapidly. But it doesn't look like the US has an appetite for a long war. The US population does not have an appetite for a long war at all. Something like 85 or 87% of the US public is against the war. The US is entering into another round of elections. And so I don't think that this is going to last. Certainly the Americans don't want it to last that long. They have also made ceasefire overtures over the weekend, to which the Iranians said they are not interested. So it's not clear to me that the Iranian economy is going to, you know, fall apart as a result of this war. The other factor is that, I mean, we have to be honest, Iran has been sort of at low intensity war with the United States and the forces of imperialism, including the Zionists, for many, many years, for decades. And so no one, I think, is better at handling this kind of hostility than the Iranians. In fact, when Russia came under very severe sanctions after the after the NATO war was launched in Ukraine, they went to Iran and learned from Iran how to deal with those sanctions. And so that's another factor I think that's important. Lastly, they've been getting ready. I mean, the reality is they've been getting ready for this. They knew it was coming. Khamenei did multiple speeches over the course of the last period, right, since Al-Aqsa flood, basically preparing, but especially after the 12-day war, basically preparing the population for this moment. They told the population, you know, you don't be wasteful, uh, preserve water and bread and flour. And so it seems like there was significant readiness for this moment. Now, this is not to say that Iran is not going to suffer. In fact, I think Iran is going to get hit very, very hard. And just, I think yesterday, the US and the Zionists started bombing hospitals, and we saw videos and images coming out that are akin to the early days of the genocide and the war on Gaza. So I think we're in for a period that's going to be very, very bloody, especially for the Iranians. But I don't think that's going to destroy the Iranian economy or the Iranian nation state.
I wanted to ask you about the impact of this war on U.S. Domestic policy, politics, or U.S. domestic economy or politics itself. Given throughout the genocide, we saw a massive shift of public opinion within the United States, and given, as you have said, 75 to 85% of U.S. citizens don't support, including one third or maybe even more segment of the Republicans not supporting this war. Would this war expose U.S. foreign policy and U.S. imperialism in West Asia even more to Americans who have been hitherto perhaps um, uh, unaware of U.S. imperialism or its existence?
Yeah, I mean, I think nothing could expose US imperialism and its savagery more so than the genocide in Gaza did. Excuse me, because of the fact that it was live streamed. The genocide in Gaza uh, is not, I hate to say this, but the fact of the matter is that the genocide in Gaza was not a historical aberration. Um, Europe and the West and the United States have committed many genocides throughout the period during which they controlled the planet. The genocide in Gaza was like those genocides. The only things that make it different are that it was live streamed and that they used modern technology, right? And so modern technology is particularly violent and effective. That being said, uh, the U.S. public is tired and of these wars. And headlines in the US over the last couple of years have been the war-weary US public does not want another war, things like that. Just this morning, I did a quick review of the mainstream media, sort of the big newspapers, the big American newspapers, and they're all saying, like, they're all concerned. They're all concerned about how this is going to play out. Um, when the markets open up today, that's a very serious concern when the markets open up today. And I think President Trump is doing a press conference at 8 a.m., I think in 20 minutes, um, likely to get ahead of the markets. It's not going to work. And even if it does work maybe a little bit, to the extent that this war drags out, it's not going to get far. So that is a major factor that's going to affect the US public. Also, the US public is weary of its own struggles economically and financially. The sort of neoliberalism has completely taken hold of US life. Resources or public resources are no longer available for the people the way they were before. Whatever modicum of public support or welfare state that existed before, that's been completely decimated. Um, and as you probably know, there are, under the guise of immigration enforcement, there are basically brown shirts running in the streets of major US cities, especially those cities that are heavily democratic cities or run by leadership that have come out against the Trump administration. And so on the one hand, this is important for two reasons. On the one hand, the people of those cities feel under siege, right? On the other hand, there's also a political retributive aspect of this, where the Trump administration is actively trying to suppress its liberal or centrist opposition. And this is very significant because the political divisions in the United States are only growing, they're only worsening. And historically, wars have, like the Iraq War, brought the Americans together, right? For better or for worse. For worse, Americans united in support of that horrific war. This war does not appear to have that consequence. And I don't really know if there's any way to change that trajectory, especially as there are images today of caskets draped, shrouded in American flags coming home from just 2 days. Just 2 days. The Americans say 3 were killed. The Iranians are saying over 500 were killed. Whatever the figure, if it's somewhere in between, in 2 days, that's a significant figure. It's an incredibly significant figure. So I don't see an easy out for the Americans, especially if the Iranians continue to reject ceasefire overtures. It seems that the only option on the table that the Iranians will accept is a retreat from the region. They want a retreat of US imperialism from the region.
We'll leave it there. This was a very helpful conversation, and thank you so much for joining.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.